My name is Pam Mitchell, and I am a member of the Arts Lecture Committee from the Arts Committee. It's absolutely my pleasure today to introduce Teresa Papanikolas, who is going to be talking with us about the exhibit that's currently at the Seattle Art Museum from Jacob Lawrence, Struggle, the History of the American People. Dr. Papadopoulos is the Anne M. Barwick Curator of American Art at SAM, a position she assumed in 2019. Prior to that, she was Deputy Director of Art and Programs and Curator of American and European Art at the Honolulu Museum of Art. A specialist in American and European modernism, she has published widely on Dada and Surrealism. Teresa, we are absolutely delighted to have you back again and very excited to hear what you have to say about the Struggle exhibit. Teresa Papanikolas.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. It's great to see everybody. This is my second appearance at Horizon House, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I am going to share my screen so you can look at some beautiful pictures, and as opposed to me this whole time. So here we go. Okay, so the topic of my talk today is Jacob Lawrence, the American Struggle, and that is the exhibition that is currently on view at the Seattle Art Museum where I work, and it opened on March 5th. It's on view until May 23rd, and if you haven't seen it yet, get your tickets now. It is an absolutely wonderful exhibition. Before I dive in, I mean, I know that I'm here as the sort of intellectual talking head. I'm, lending my own expertise on the subject and on the exhibition itself. And I'm in fact the curator of the exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum. But I just want to remind everybody that a major museum exhibition happens thanks to a great many people. And at SAM, one of the things we do that is unique from many museums is we convene advisory committees for each of our special exhibition. And these are people who are stakeholders in the topic of the show. They lend subject expertise beyond the history of art. A lot of them are artists and educators, and this group advises us on everything from our marketing strategies to our label content to even, in cases, some of the choices of work that we decide to have on view in the gallery. And so here's our advisory group. I'm not going to read all their names, but I just wanted to make you aware that we had a lot of help in addition to the SAM staff in pulling this exhibition off. Now, many of you may remember, and we were actually talking about this before we started the recording, that when SAM exhibited Jacob Lawrence's Migration series. So this was a series that the artist Jacob Lawrence did in 1942, and it deals with the Great Migration, the migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North in search of greater economic and social and just, lifestyle opportunities. That show opened in early 2017, and as it happened, it coincided with the presidential inauguration for that year. And so our visitors seem to find this very, very timely. The show attracted 10,000 visitors in the first 3 days, and many of you might have had an opportunity to see that exhibition. The Struggle series also deals with, it's also by Jacob Lawrence, and it's also a series by Jacob Lawrence. But it's another series that Lawrence did. He did this several years after he did the Migration series. He started working on it in the mid-50s, and it's called Struggle from the History of the American People. The show was, speaking of Takes a Village, was organized by the Peabody Essex in Salem, Massachusetts, in collaboration with the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. And Sam is the fourth stop on its national tour. We're the only West Coast venue, so we're the only place on the West Coast that you can see this show. And what I'm showing you here is an installation shot from our galleries. This is the work on view at SAM. There's also a major publication in conjunction with the exhibition. So it's a big deal. It's on a 5-city tour. We're the fourth stop. The series focuses on paintings that the American painter Jacob Lawrence did in the mid-1950s. And it's called Struggle from the History of the American People. Now, Lawrence liked to paint in series. He did some 10 series throughout his career, most famously the Migration series. And this one was comprised of 30 small paintings that together tell the story of the United States from the Revolution through the Constitution, the War of 1812, and finally westward expansion. But the story that Lawrence tells is not a story of heroes or of noted historical figures, although they do figure into it, but one told from the perspective of all Americans and in a variety of voices: African American, Indigenous, immigrants, women, all of whom Lawrence felt contributed to America's story. So he's offering a more inclusive version of American history. But before I get into the paintings themselves, I first want to say that this exhibition is a landmark moment in the critical fortunes of the Struggle series. Lawrence first exhibited the paintings together in 1956, so this was the year that he completed them, at the Allen Gallery in New York, and then the Allen Gallery exhibited them again together in 1958. And after that, the paintings were sold. First, they were sold to another dealer, and then they were dispersed through collections, both private and public, throughout the United States. And so they were never exhibited or brought together again in their current cohesive state as a series. So these pictures, unlike the Migration series, have really lived their lives as discrete individual works and been exhibited as such. So this is the first time a significant concentration of works from the Struggle series has been exhibited together in literally decades, not since the 1950s. The exhibition includes 24 of the 30 paintings, so 3 have never resurfaced since the original exhibition, and then 3 others are too fragile to travel. So we have 24 of the 30 paintings on view. And if you look in the slide, let me see if I can point to, oops. Right here, you see an empty frame that denotes one of the missing paintings in the series, and I'll get to those in a bit. So here's a photograph of Lawrence in front of panel 18, or actually it's not panel 18. He's in front of 2 panels from the series, and both of these panels, interestingly, live in Seattle. They're in private collections here in town, and they're both on view at SAM right now. Now, who is Jacob Lawrence? So we in Seattle know him, a lot of you know him very well, as a professor at the University of Washington, a longtime figure in the local art scene, together with his wife, Gwendolyn. He grew up in Harlem, and there he received his earliest education. So he came from New York, and he was really a New Yorker before his move to Seattle in 1970. He studied African-American history and art with some of the leading arts educators of the time, including Charles Alston, who was the leader of the WPA Harlem Mural Project, and Augustus Savage, who was the founder of the Savage Studio School of Arts and Crafts in Harlem. He was also an avid researcher, and he frequented the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which is now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And this branch of the Y, this 135th Street branch, housed a massive collection of archives and history books on American and especially African American history. And these materials became Lawrence's sources for struggle. So early in his career, and here are 2 panels from the Migration series, Lawrence focused exclusively on African American subjects, like life in Harlem, events in Black history, and most famously in the Migration, the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North to participate more fully in American life. And in these pictures, you see various vignettes of experiences and events, challenges and struggles associated with the migration. So it's not a linear narrative by any means. And you also see the early hallmarks of Lawrence's style, the abstraction of the combination of abstraction and figuration, the flattened forms, the constructing of composition through form and color, this sort of collage approach to constructing a composition. And also the use of color, space, and shape to suggest moods and emotions rather than articulate a clear narrative. The Migration series brought Lawrence early fame. It was exhibited in 1941, the year it was completed, and that is the year it was completed. I think I said 1942 earlier, that was wrong. And the gallerist Edith Halpert, who was an early champion of Lawrence, promptly exhibited it upon its completion. And Edith Halpert was famously the director of the Downtown Gallery. And this was a very famous gallery. She represented most of the American modernists at that time. And so she gave Lawrence his first big break, his first solo show. And the exhibition got written up in Fortune magazine. And that's what I'm showing you here. So this is the spread on the Migration series. So he had early fame, and then later in his life, most famously for us in Seattle, he spent the last 2-3 decades of his life here. And so here I'm showing you 2 pictures of Lawrence. One is a photograph of him in his attic studio here in town, and on the right is a self-portrait of Lawrence. It's a painting, it's in Sam's collection of the artist in that same studio. He moved here in 1970 to be a visiting artist at the University of Washington after teaching at Black Mountain College, the Art Students League, the Pratt Institute, and the New School for Social Research. So he took himself very, very seriously as an educator. After his stint as a visiting artist was over, he joined the faculty, and he stayed on in Seattle to become a prominent figure on Seattle's art scene. He's a big presence at SAM. We have many of his archives in the collection. We have, weirdly, all of his tools in the collection. They're not in the actual art collection, but they're in the museum. We have his works in the collection. And then there's also at SAM the Jacob Lawrence Gallery, where we showed the Migration series 4 years ago, and the Gwendolyn Knight and Jacob Lawrence Prize. So their legacy supports emerging Black artists. He also, as you know, has a history at Horizon House. He and his wife, Gwen, had 3 apartments in the building. And I'm forgetting which tower, but we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. So they had one to live in, and then each had a studio. So they kind of lived in grand style, but I'm told that they also were, super gracious and really into the social life of your community. Many of you still remember them, and especially Lawrence for his graciousness, his intelligence, his friendship, and then also, most of all, his love for a dry martini. That came up a lot in the anecdotes. So back to the Struggle series, here's another installation shot. He painted the series against a backdrop of social and political turmoil in America. This was the time, so 1954 is when he starts painting the series, and this is the time of the Civil Rights Movement, McCarthyism, the Cold War. So it's a very politically charged moment in American history. And for Lawrence, watershed events such as these highlighted the ideological, political, and racial struggles in which all Americans were engaged. And so he saw the issue of struggle as something interwoven into the fabric of American history, and the Struggle series as reflective of that universal struggle. And so what we see are, images not so much like of struggle, although struggle figures prominently in them, but that embody the notion of struggle, that show American history not as a fait accompli or something with predetermined results, but as something that's unfolding over time, something in progress and whose outcome is unclear. And there are instances in which this struggle, this idea of struggle, this universal concept, resonate with issues relevant both in Lawrence's time and today. So many of the historical events that Lawrence engages in struggle remind one or evoke events that were happening when Lawrence painted the series. So the Struggle series is about American history, but he's presenting American history in alternative ways to their usual heroes' tales. Many of the panels are titled with a quotation. I'm showing you panel 4, which comes from Paul Revere's account of his ride into Lexington, and it's titled simply, "I alarmed almost every house till I got to Lexington, Paul Revere, 1775." And so this title is inviting us into the perspective of the person telling the story. So these aren't third person narratives. These are in fact kind of first person narratives. We're experiencing history as the people telling its stories experienced it. And so focusing on panel 4 for a bit, it's about, of course, Paul Revere's ride into Lexington with the warning that the British were coming. So the British troops were approaching and about to invade. Lawrence's treatment is very different from the traditional Paul Revere imagery, and I'm showing you on the right, Grant Wood's The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you can see that Wood conceptualizes this event very differently than Lawrence did. You see the town of Lexington, quiet and sleepy under the cover of night, Revere riding in on his horse right here, kind of I think you can kind of see his arm gesturing out. He's like yelling out, "The British are coming." It's a very almost cliched version of these events. Lights are coming on one by one, so people are waking up to the fact that the British are indeed coming. Lawrence treats this scene very differently. First of all, it's hard to tell where Paul Revere actually is in this scene. In fact, he's right here in the center, and he's whispering to this man next to him, "The British are coming." So it's a much quieter, more subtle, probably a little more strategic of a warning. He's dressed in a black cloak that blends in with his black horse, evoking his nighttime ride that he's entering the town under the cover of night. Hard to see, he's camouflaged. So again, this sort of clandestine nature of this event. And then the whole space is claustrophobic. A lot of people have been remarking when visiting the show how cubist this space looks like, how it's difficult to tell the figures from each other, how they blend with each other and with the ground on which they stand, how the space is compressed, almost claustrophobic. And what Lawrence is doing is he's placing us into the center of the action. He's making us a part of this historical event. And again, the outcome at this point is unclear. Will Revere successfully warn the townspeople of Lexington, or, will in fact the British successfully invade Lexington? Right now, at this moment, when he's alarming every house, getting to Lexington, we don't know. Similarly, with panel 10, which is about George Washington's infamous crossing of the Delaware River, Lawrence tells the story from the perspective not of Washington, but from one of his men, one Tech Tilghman, who was his aide-de-camp, who writes, "We crossed the river at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles above Trenton. The night was excessively severe, which the men bore without the least murmur." So he's describing a very cold night, severe weather conditions, but also the stoic heroism of Washington's army. And so does Lawrence's treatment. So this is not your typical, scene that we're all used to of Lawrence crossing the Delaware. And I'm showing you Emanuel Leutz's classic, cliched, another art historical cliche here, Washington crossing the Delaware, where Washington is standing impossibly in his boat that's being they're like navigating all of these ice flows. They're crossing the river. He's standing there, leading his troops. There's a flag waving. It's a scene of great heroism. Lawrence presents us with a very different scene, a scene of men huddled into their boats against the cold, being roiled by the river, by the water, the frigid water of the river. So, again, showing you this moment in time where the outcome is unclear and the conditions are treacherous. Other panels tell the story from the perspective of the other side, not the winners, but the losers in battle. So in panel 8, which is about the Battle of Bennington, it's told from the perspective of a Hessian soldier, so a soldier for hire on the side of the British, which lost the battle brutally. It was a devastating loss for the British. And so here we see the thick of the battle, a jumble of horses and men with no clear outcome as to who is going to emerge victorious. Panel 9 is called Simply Defeat. Its subject is the Battle of Philadelphia, a brutal loss for the rebel army this time. And it was one that was followed by 6 months of severe hardship, horrible weather, lots of starvation, and Lawrence really captures this desperate moment in the American Revolution in a very poignant way, where we see the men huddled against the cold. In the foreground is a fallen war horse with their bloody bayonets surrounding it. Panel 2 is a good example of the struggle series resonance, not only in Lawrence's present, but in ours. Its subject is the Boston Massacre, which was a case in which an argument between a colonist and 2 British guards escalated into a riot in which 5 people died. And the first victim of this riot was Crispus Attucks, who was a sailor of African-American and indigenous descent. Lawrence centers Attucks, and so here's Attucks here, vomiting blood, in a scene not of battle, but of solidarity. So he's fallen, his comrades are rallying around him. There's not a single British soldier in the scene. And this theme of rallying around a common cause, of rallying around a fallen comrade, is something that would have been highly relevant in Lawrence's time. In 1954, when he painted this, African Americans were rallying around the death of Emmett Till, who was an African American youth murdered by some white guys in Mississippi, and who were never reprimanded for it. And so this murder and the injustice surrounding it became a symbol for the disparities between whites and African Americans that galvanized even further the civil rights movement. And so this was something that was highly resonant in Lawrence's time. And he paints the scene deliberately to capture this resonance. And it's in fact something that's highly resonant today as well. Some of the panels deal with slavery, but like the massacre in Boston, they use those events to foreground the historic struggle for civil rights in America. And so here are 2 pictures of uprisings of enslaved people, and they signal the ongoing and regular uprisings of the abolitionist movement. But they also explore issues relevant in Lawrence's time, such as debates over different approaches to protest, both violent and nonviolent, and the idea that the fight for justice is ongoing. So he's not dealing with slavery just as a moment in American history, but uses that history that explore issues that continue to be highly relevant. Other scenes deal with westward expansion and invite us to consider the human and environmental cost of this expansion. So panel 18 on the right, the title is taken from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Lewis and Clark as they're embarking on their voyage of discovery expedition. But it's focused, and so the letter is talking about how they should treat the native, the indigenous people, but the composition itself focuses not on Lewis and Clark, who are here, but on their Shoshone translator and guide, Sacagawea. And in doing so, he's forcing us to think about the displacement of Native people that this expedition triggered, because it in fact increased the size of the United States substantially. Panel 22, trappers, refers to trapping of big game along the Bitterroot Trail in what is now Montana. But the focus is not on trappers, but literally on their victims, on what they trapped, showing the environmental cost of westward expansion. So remember that Lawrence painted the struggle series in the 1950s, and this was the heyday of abstract expressionism. The New York School was really having its moment. And this was a movement in American painting that staunchly resisted narrative and figuration. It was purely about abstraction and about the process of painting in and of itself. Lawrence's approach to painting is all about figures and narrative, but I'm showing you this comparison not to show like how Lawrence contrasts with his abstract expressionist contemporaries, but in fact how Lawrence is really in this context. He's using languages of abstraction to bolster the stories he's telling: line, form, color, highly expressive treatment of paint, of his compositions to really sort of get the point across. So each of these works is not only a narrative experience, but also an aesthetic one as well. And so in these two, I see these as, I mean, they're figural, right? You can see what's going on in them, but I see these pictures as highly abstract as well, in that he's using form, color, and symbolism to picture abstract concepts such as victory and defeat on the left, and all you see are two arms, one arm relinquishing the sword to the other arm. And this is about the Battle of Yorktown, the definitive victory in the American Revolution, in which the British troops ultimately surrendered. And so you see this transfer of power symbolized in these two arms, set against the backdrop of 22 cannonballs, symbolizing the 22-day siege of this battle, reminding us again that the outcome was not unclear. Those 22 days were rough indeed. Panel 26 is simply about peace. It's about the concept of peace, how fragile it is. You see flowers kind of poking their way up impossibly through scorched earth, a symbol of both hope, sort of despair, of fragility, of, you know, the fact that peace is something that's hard won and something that needs to be worked for. The historical event that it's coinciding with or referring to is the signing of the Treaty of Ghant, which ended the War of 1812 and put a stop once and for all to American conflicts with the British. But it was a hollow victory for many Americans, especially the enslaved people who fought in the War of 1812, only to be returned to slavery, and the Native Americans who were promised a state in the Northwest Territory that never materialized. So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, 3 of the works in the Struggle series are missing. We don't know their whereabouts. They are, in one case, unpublished, and that's why it's represented by an empty frame. We simply don't know what it is. I mean, where it is, much less what it's about. And then the remaining 2 are in the show as not exhibitions, as reproductions. So we have photographic reproductions of these works, so visitors can experience the series as a series and not see and see as few missing gaps as possible. And this is one of them. It's in black and white because we only have a black and white photograph of the work. So the other one, the third one, which I'm not showing you, which I probably should have incorporated into this talk, is in color. And that's because, this is the best part, it resurfaced like in 2000, and then it went underground again. It got lost again. So it kind of like popped up just long enough to be photographed. And that's the one of the Erie Canal. 2 panels, however, were recently rediscovered, and both are in the exhibition. And this is a great story, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell it, although I'm sure you all read about it in the New York Times because it was just highly publicized and super exciting. So panel 16 is the panel on your right, and this was another unpublished work. So if you have the catalog of the exhibition and you turn to the page on panel 16, you'll see that that page is blank. I mean, it's not blank, there's like text on it, but there's no illustration because at the time the catalog was published, we didn't know what panel 16 looked like. It had no one had ever seen it. Well, last fall, when the exhibition was on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, somebody, their friend, like, how does this go? So their friend was at the museum, saw the Struggle series, and told them that, hey, you should really check into your painting. And lo and behold, it was panel 16 from the Struggle series. And so that's in the exhibition. It deals with Shays' Rebellion. And so these are it's the uprisings, the farmers' uprisings that were happening throughout Massachusetts against high taxation to pay for the revolution. And then panel 28 on the right was another one of these panels that we knew only in black and white images. And then last December, not too far from where panel 16 was discovered, so in a house close by in the same neighborhood, and these are both kind of on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, someone was Googling the Jacob Lawrence show and saw a picture of the image of this painting, and realized that, oh my gosh, that's like the same painting that's hanging in my dining room. And lo and behold, it was signed by Jacob Lawrence. So panel 28 then came to light, and it is also in the show. And you can see on panel 28, oops, it's had kind of a rough life. There's a lot of abrasion here. We think that Lawrence maybe had gotten some bad paint tubes, and so the paint didn't really adhere to the board, as well as the paint in his other works did. So we consolidated it, got it fit for travel, and were able to bring it to the museum. So in addition to the missing works, and then all the works that are not missing, the struggle series, let's just leave it at that, the exhibition also features work by 3 contemporary artists whose work resonates with the struggle series. And all of these artists, like Lawrence, use archival material. They've done a lot of research. They use historical sources to explore and show continuities between the past and the present. And so Derek Adams is represented in the exhibition by 2 works. And on the left is a video installation called Saints March, and the exhibition kind of closes with this work. It's all about how history and memory and place interconnect through time. It's a video of tap dancers on Decatur Street in New Orleans. So these are street tappers. They've taken crushed up soda cans and affixed them to the bottom of their shoes to create tap shoes. And they're dancing to an a cappella arrangement of Louis Armstrong's 1938 recording of When the Saints Go Marching In. So it's anchoring tap in jazz, so 2 very highly American genres of music and dance. They're anchoring those in each other, jazz in New Orleans, to evoke the timelessness of a place and the artists who inhabit it and the media who operate within it. Much in the same way the struggle series anchors history in the experience of all Americans, past and present. And then on the right is an installation piece by Derek called Jacob's Ladder. And here you see a portrait of Lawrence right here. And then it's against a backdrop, a wallpaper. It's hung on a wallpaper that's made up of a photo montage of photographs of Lawrence throughout the years. Adams is a huge admirer of Jacob Lawrence, and this is his homage to him. And so in addition to the portrait and the photographs, you see a chair. That's Lawrence's studio chair. So that's the chair he had in his studio. And then if you go around and you look in the seat of the chair, there's an open book, which is a book from his library. And there's also a phonograph playing with a record on it, which is Lawrence's phonograph. Bethany Collins explores the shifting meanings of and words and images over time. And on the right is, so actually what you're seeing here is her installation at SAM, and it's comprised of 2 works. And so first is this book, which is open in a case, and then around it, and it's impossible to see, is wallpaper. So first I'll talk about the book. So the book is open to in the book, Collins has printed successive iterations of the song My Country 'Tis of Thee. And so this is a song, it's like the first song we all learned, right? It's a song that was originated in England. It was imported to America, and then it was written and rewritten over time to reflect the varying issues and causes that were rewriting it and writing it and rewriting it, including revolution, suffrage, abolition, native sovereignty, even the Confederacy. So the book is there open on view, and we have to like switch the pages every couple of months. And then surrounding you as you're in the space is an audio soundtrack with these different versions, different iterations of My Country 'Tis of Thee playing simultaneously. And then on the walls of the space is another work called Meet Me at Moonlight, and it's wallpaper. It's flocked with flowers of like 200 different species of wildflowers that are native to the American South. And it's referencing the encyclopedias known as floriography, in which flowers served as a coded language. And floriography were widely used during the abolitionist movement and also during the Great Migration as African Americans moved, as great waves of African Americans moved from place to place and needed to communicate with each other. And so symbols are being used as language, and she's exploring how this symbology of language remains constant over time, but then also shifts in meaning slightly. And finally, Hank Willis Thomas uses archives to create work about unresolved issues in American history and to open up new dialogue. So his work is highly conceptual. And he appropriates images from the public domain and reworks them. So on the left, and I'm focusing here on this sculptural piece, it's called Rich Black Specimen, and it's a two-dimensional, well, it's three-dimensional, all sculpture is three-dimensional, but it's two-dimensional, so it kind of emerges and takes form as you walk around it. And the shape of this and the human shape comes from a stock image that would have been used in broadsides during the period of slavery to advertise for enslaved slaves, and they would have, or escaped slaves. And they would have been accompanied by text. The text accompanying this one would be Rich Black Specimens, this totally offensive language. And what Thomas has done is he's taken that image, enlarged it, and therefore humanized it, made it into sculpture, almost setting it in motion to really drive home the desperation of an escaped slave, and then also to remind us that this is human beings. And then on the right, he's taken photographs from the civil rights movement, and again, these are just stock images, and he's layered them over each other and coated them with a special coating. So this is the same image seen twice, so that the full image emerges when you take a flash photograph of it. So what he's doing is showing how, again, this idea how images often offer either a skewed perspective of history, or they gain meaning over time. And then finally, the exhibition ends with a display of work organized by our teen artist group. And so the TAG team is a group of youths at SAM, and they are fully engaged in the museum. They visit all of our exhibitions, they have meetings, they have art projects, classes, all of these different things. And what they decided to do was have a juried show of young artists, inviting them to imagine what a 31st panel in the series would look like if Lawrence were to paint it today. So they issued a call to artists asking this question. They got about 21, I believe, responses. And out of those 21, they selected 12, and they asked them to create a work. And so they gave them each a piece of canvas the size of one of the paintings in the series, and just told them to have at it. And this is what they came up with. So I'll end here to say that the exhibition, Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle, through the work of these 4 artists, Lawrence, Adams, Collins, and Thomas, as well as 12 youth artists, more than merely retells events in American history, or even offers a debate on who owns that history, but offers a powerful statement about this history as the collective experience of all Americans. Thank you. And I'll take questions. And I'll also stop sharing.
Thank you, Teresa. That was a fascinating view into an artist we feel a special connection to here, and into a very interesting exhibition. And now, if the rest of the audience will turn their cameras on, we'll see who has questions. Remember to mute yourself now, but unmute unmute and say question if you have a question to ask.
Question.
Yes, Mary.
Yeah, thank you. Teresa, thank you again for being with us. It was wonderful to listen again. So I just have a quick question about the reception. Since it was done during the civil rights unrest, I wonder about public's reception of the struggle series that Lawrence got for this, and how was it different maybe from the migration series?
So thank you for that question, Mary. So it definitely wasn't quite as celebrated as the migration series. And it was a little bit of a hard sell to the public. Now, in terms of like how well attended the exhibition is, that I'm not sure about, but I do know that it was hard to sell to collectors. And so this is why the original dealer, Alan, sold it to this other dealer just to kind of basically take it off his hands. And so this was kind of a bummer of a moment for Lawrence in his career, that a lot of scholars think that it's also because he was an African-American artist. So he was, and this is a time when, let's just say it, this is at the heyday of abstract expressionism, when these celebrated figures in the art world in America, if we're talking about the avant-garde art world, which is what Lawrence also aspired to, and these are the circles that he moved in, were privileging white male artists who were painting large-scale abstractions. And Lawrence was a Black artist who was painting very small narrative series. So his work was kind of against the tide of what was really in vogue in the American art world at this time. So it's, both the political content, which I think a lot of people found, a little bit challenging with the struggle series, but then also Lawrence's approach to painting, which put him in a bit of a difficult position at this moment in time.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one. Yes. Is there one of these panels that you consider to be stronger or more interesting than the rest? Or I guess I'm trying to ask, what is the one you think is most interesting?
Oh my God, it changes. Like it changes every 5 minutes. But I mean, every time I go into the space, I find a different picture. And that's one of the really amazing things about these paintings is you cannot stop learning from them. You can't stop looking at them. It's like every time you turn away and then you come back to them, you learn something new. And I'm saying you because this is my experience, but then people who I've talked to who've come to the exhibition, they're saying this too. And so for a long time, before I actually saw the works in person, my personal favorite was The Victory and Defeat, the one about the Battle of Yorktown, because I just love the economy of means through which Lawrence has just created this highly powerful, highly symbolic image about this like definitive moment. I mean, I would say probably it's the only painting in the series that really is definitive, but even then it has a lot of ambiguity to it because the actual surrender wasn't even a surrender at all. General Cornwallis sent a proxy to actually relinquish the sword. So it was just kind of a hollow victory in many ways. So that for a long time was my favorite one, and it remains so. But then, I mean, I'm going down to the museum tomorrow and I have to give 3 tours of the exhibition, and I know I'm going to find other things and other things to learn and discover in the series.
Thank you.
Yes, Mary Jo. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. How long a period did it take to paint a series like this? And where was he living when he painted this series?
So he was living in New York, and I think by then he had moved to Brooklyn. So he grew up in Harlem, and then he moved to Brooklyn, and didn't really like it that much. He just really identified more with Harlem. But anyway, so he's living in New York. This series took him from start to panel 30, which was the stopping point. It took him 2 years. So he started painting them in 1954 and finished painting panel 30 in 1956 when it was then exhibited. But his planning and his research for it, I would say, started between the time he completed the migration series and the time he embarked on the struggle series, because he conducted a considerable amount of research to do the series and plan it. And he originally planned on 60 paintings for the series. And they were going to start in the Revolution and then go up until I think World War I. And so they were going to deal with a lot more additional struggles in American history, but for whatever reason, he decided to stop at panel 30 when the series was first exhibited.
Thank you.
Yes, Anne.
It sounds like as if at least one of these paintings is under private ownership. Are most of them owned by museums or galleries, or who owns most of them?
So the biggest concentration is owned by this one collector called Harvey Ross. And Harvey Ross has made it a kind of obsession. No, I don't want to say that because that's mean. And he's really nice, but Harvey Ross has kind of dedicated the past several years to buying up as many paintings from the struggle series that come available. So he's one of the big collectors of Jacob Lawrence, and especially this series. And then there are others in private collections. There are some in museums. So there's one in the Met. There's one at the Harvard University Art Museums. There's a couple at the Cantor Center in Stanford. And so those are the museums that have them. But yeah, the rest are private collections. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about the process of putting something this enormous together across, well, this is the fourth stop, 5 museums across the United States. It blows my mind.
It takes a lot of people to do. So Sam booked this show shortly before I came to Sam in 2019. So by 2018, Seattle Art Museum was part of the tour. The show originated as sort of the mastermind of 2 curators who, unbeknownst to each other, were both working on the struggle series. And one of them was Austin Bailey, who was at the Peabody Essex Museum at the time. She's now at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. And the other was Elizabeth Hutton Turner, who's a Lawrence scholar and a curator at the Phillips Collection. And I'm trying to remember how Austin told me the story. I guess they were at a conference. You know, they might have been at the curators conference, and they happened to say, and at those conferences we're like, so what are you working on? What are you working on? And so they both found out they were each working on an exhibition of the struggle series. And so they joined forces. And that's how the Phillips Collection came to partner with the Peabody Essex Museum in becoming the organizing venues for this exhibition. And so they then will go out and just shop it around and get other museums to sign on for the tour. And that's what we did, and the Met did, and the Birmingham Museum of Art. So we're the other 3 venues. And then within each institution, there's another curator who kind of shepherds it through that process. And that's what I'm doing at SAM. And then a whole team, then the team kind of mobilizes to do it. So we've been working on the show for about the past couple of years, if you count all of the marketing strategies that we've come up with, the installation design, the convening the advisory group, writing and editing the labels, and just like all this, developing programming around the show, getting the teen art, all situated in the museum, which was no small feat if you know teenagers. And just so it really is the work of many, many different people, and it takes several years.
In addition to the charges of insurance and mailing and, in general, hanging the exhibit, is there a sort of a rental fee to the group that organized the original exhibition?
Yeah, yes. So the venues all pay like a fee to the exhibition to the organizing institution to take the show. And then we all share costs. So we'll share the cost of shipping and insurance and packing everything up, and just like, all of those things. And then there's also costs called local costs. And those are the costs we assume to put the show on in our space. So those are the cost of materials to build out the installation, any sort of marketing we want to do, any programming, like if we have lecturers come in, paying them honoraria, travel expenses. Like, for example, I went to the opening of the show at Peabody, Essex, so that was part of the exhibition budget too. So yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Question. The one panel that of which you only have a photograph is called Peace or titled Peace, as is the one in front of it, I think. Do you know what he was thinking with those two panels with the same title right next to one another?
They so they're different moments of peace, and they're different. So one's the War of 1812, and the one with the cannon, I'm so sorry, I'm kind of blanking which piece is being referred to. But they both, they both are sort of, well, the one with the flowers is kind of a fragile piece, right? And I discussed that. The one with the cannon is kind of tilted down, or is it tilted down? I'm trying to remember. But anyway, it's just sort of it's like a benign, dormant cannon. So it's really like showing this instrument of war that's no longer in use. But and I think that Lawrence had, repeated the concept of peace because in a weird way, it reminds us of the ongoing struggle. Like, yes, there was there's a period of peace after the American Revolution, but really it's not peaceful because, there's all the Shays Rebellion and all the farmers' rebellions, and then finally the War of 1812, and the tensions with the British continued and were ongoing. So, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Mhm.
Question.
I have one in regards to the exhibit itself. On the insurance, do you pick up the insurance from the time it comes into Seattle and then it gets out to where it goes next, and then Sam's through with it?
So we insure it from the time it leaves
Okay.
the place it was before until the time it gets to wherever it's going. So we've insured it since it left the Birmingham Museum of Art, and we will insure it until it arrives at the Phillips collection.
Okay, that's what I thought. I was just wondering. Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
The painting that came from the dining room on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, will that ultimately get back to the dining room?
Yes, it will. It will. We'll give it. We're going to give it back. we promised that it would come back to her, and it has a new frame. So
Yeah. I have a question. I think I'm unmuted. I saw in a UW thing that there's going to be a course about Jacob Lawrence and his influence on art this spring quarter, and that you're going to be speaking to those students as well. What angle will you be talking about his work to them, say, as contrasted to what you did here with us?
So that's a good question. So thank you for reminding me that I have to do that. I can do a lot of things. Like, I mean, one of the things is I'll present a lot of the same material that I presented to you all today, but also I will probably show a lot more installation shots, and so that the students can have a sense of the space too. Because one of the things they wanted to do was come see the show, but we can't have group tours at the museum yet, and there's 19 students in that class, plus their professor, plus me. And so that's too big of too big of a group of people to take through the museum at that time based on what we're currently allowing. So yeah, so it'll be, I'm thinking I'll probably have a conversation with the professor of the class just to kind of make sure it sets into the context of what she's talking about. That class is on, it's on Jacob Lawrence, and it's also on, Jacob Lawrence in Seattle. So there's going to be a lot about his legacy here and that sort of thing. Yes, Mary Jo, you've had your hand up.
There it is. So I'm curious about his early days of and entering into art. I mean, did he start as a young high school student, or how did those early days play out?
He did. He started as a youth in art, where and he was studying with Charles Alston who was the head of the Washington Mural Project. So he worked on the murals and learned painting from Alston, and he also learned from Augusta Savage. And those, and especially Alston, that mural tradition, that way of really painting flat shapes on a wall, you know how those WPA murals look, really made an imprint on him.
Yeah, I can see
And
that.
then he was a real independent scholar. The years spent at the library were in his youth. He was, that's how he learned. Spent hours there.
Thank you.
I have a question. I've been intrigued by the similarities between the Coast Salish peoples with their strong use of red, blues, and blacks, and his strong uses of red, blues, and blacks. And I wonder if there was any comment you had about that. How we're seeing what the totem poles look like at some point with their colors and his strong use of those colors.
Yeah, I mean, that strong primaries is something that he did, that he used from day one. That became a hallmark of his style. So it's not, I don't think it's so much a question of influence. Although I do think when he got to Seattle and would have had an opportunity to see that work, it would have resonated with him, and indeed it did. But what he really loved, one of the cool anecdotes I've collected, during my time with this work is from Pam McCluskey, who's our curator of African art. And many of you know Pam, she's been at the museum forever. And so she knew Jacob Lawrence and she was friends with him. And she would invite him into the museum and into her collections and just kind of look at what he would respond to. And he loved the African collections. And I believe, and he might have even curated shows or else helped her in her curatorial choices, and what he responded to in the African collections was quite instructive, because he responded to them almost like a cubist would. He responded to the flat forms and flat shapes. And so if you think about it, the Coast Salish stuff in those terms, it stands to follow that he would have also had a strong reaction to those.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. This has been fascinating from beginning to end.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, it's nice to be back.
Right.
Hopefully in person next time.